a leading organization, the IAGS, has stated after a vote by its members, where notably, and this is important to note, where only 28% of its 500 members took part in the vote, they declared through an 86% vote that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Let me read you a little bit about this and tell you why there are more organizations than before making this declaration compared to the last 2 years. The world's leading association of genocide scholars has declared that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. A resolution passed by International Association of Genocide Scholars states that Israel's conduct meets the legal definition as laid out in the UN Convention on Genocide. Across a 3-page resolution, IAGS presents a litany of actions undertaken by Israel throughout the 22-month-long war that it recognizes that it constitutes as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The IAGS is the largest professional association of genocide scholars and includes a number of Holocaust experts. In a summary of Israel's policies and actions, the declaration notes the widespread attack on both the personnel and facilities needed for survival, including healthcare, aid, and educational sectors. Among many other elements, it notes the 50,000 killed or injured by Israel, as highlighted by UN aid organization UNICEF, which impacts the ability of Palestinians in Gaza to survive as a group and regenerate. The resolution also highlights the support among Israeli leaders for forced expulsion of all Palestinians from Gaza, alongside Israel's near total demolition of housing in the territory. The IAGS notes the statements by Israeli leaders dehumanizing Palestinians in Gaza, characterizing them as the enemy, alongside promises to flatten Gaza and turn it into hell. Another example people often use, even though it's not cited here by the BBC, is the comparison to Amalek, a religious comparison, but largely denoting this idea of a religious enemy that must be annihilated. The IAGS notes the statements by Israeli leaders dehumanizing Palestinians in Gaza, characterizing them all as the enemy, flatten Gaza, turn into hell. The Foreign Ministry said the report is based on Hamas lies and poor research, calling it an embarrassment to the legal profession. A spokesperson added that it was Israel itself which is the victim of genocide. Israel has regularly denied that its actions in Gaza amount to genocide and says its actions are justified as a mean of self-defense. So, by the way, the IAGS scholars also reiterate that what happened on October 7th is a crime, but they say that the response to it and many of the actions taken, for example, when it comes to the fact that if you are the occupying force and you control all the entries into Gaza and people in Gaza are starving, and at these aid sites, like, people are getting shot, like, it's quite difficult to get aid, and people are, and when we say, oh, famine, and people say Hamas lies, no, we're also talking about the UN. The UN-backed Food Monitor also confirmed that a famine was taking place in parts of Gaza. So when we talk about genocide going on in Gaza, the reason why more of these leading experts are coming out and saying that a genocide is taking place is because certain ways for Israel to justify their action become harder and harder. If the goal is just to destroy Hamas, why not deal with the famine and allow more food and more organizations to go in? Why is it that no journalists can enter into Gaza unless they are escorted by the Israeli armed forces? Why is it that so many people in the Israeli cabinet have talked about flattening Gaza, hell, this kind of religious talk of mumbo jumbo of religious comparisons to find the Palestinians as some sort of religious enemy that must be annihilated, or any of the talk of continued expansion of settlements or bringing settlements back, which has been talked about by a few, but has not been championed by Benjamin Netanyahu. But now we have people like Donald Trump coming out with plans like this: the Great Trust, from a demolished Iranian proxy to a prosperous Abrahamic ally, Gaza reconstruction, economic acceleration, and transformation. Now, for this plan, all the Palestinians have to leave. This is a plan that was leaked to the press. They got it. It's 38 pages. It gives a lot of detail of exactly how the United States would have engaged in Trump's Riviera of the Middle East that he talked about. It talked about over $100 billion in public investment, where this money would come from. I guess the United States. Is quite baffling considering all this talk about, oh, we can't invest in Eastern European security. We can't invest in that. We can't invest in this. We can't invest in these rural radio stations, but we can invest $100 billion into rebuilding Gaza. Though we weren't the ones that destroyed Gaza, it was the Israelis that blew up Gaza. It was Hamas that fought through the streets of Gaza. We're the ones picking up the check. Seems to go against a lot of the way Trump has talked about engaging with the rest of the world, of getting them to pick up the check and stop making America act like the world police and pick up the bill. I'm not saying that it's bad that we would even take place in any reconstruction. I'm just saying that that's a lot of money. I don't know where that money is coming from. And my God, it doesn't seem to line up with what Trump was talking about on the campaign trail. But there seems to be, there's a lot in this. And you can go through it yourself, how they talk about bringing like tech and all this different stuff to Gaza, and how, you know, it can be like a tech center, and it can be a tourism center, a gateway that they could build infrastructure in after they remove the Palestinians. And then a certain amount would be paid to essentially stay gone. Of course, most people would want to come back. That's to be believed. But I'm thinking about, if they're going to invest this much into Gaza, they're not going to give the people of Gaza control of the security situation there. And are they going to allow them to come back? Or are there going to be settlers that move into parts of Gaza? Is it going to be the parts of Gaza that has settlers, if that's what happens? That's a nice, with all of this being very vague and left up in the air, and Trump talking about why would they want to come back? He seemed to be that the Palestinians in Gaza to him seems like a barrier to his dream of a prosperous Gaza. It's weird enough to say that out loud, but it seems to be the case. Now, until they publicly present their plans, all we have is 38 slides. But when the people of Gaza are talked about more as a barrier, when the people of Gaza are talked about as a civilization that needs to be flattened, turned into hell, when the journalists are targeted, when journalists aren't let in, when the bombing has killed rakes and rakes and rakes of civilians, it leads to more and more scholars looking at the actions of the Israeli government as they continue to push into Gaza, as there being less deniability into what the outcome could be. Because if the goal is just the destruction and removal of Hamas from a position of power, if that's just the goal, then Hamas offering to step down and Hamas disarming after the creation of a Palestinian state, or earlier Saudi plans that offered something similar to that, would have at least gotten some consideration. Or there could be a talk of the process of how Hamas would disarm. Or there would be a talk of, if Hamas is gone, only then, and then could there ever be a discussion about a Palestinian state? And then we could create maybe a Palestinian state. Like the idea of creating a future for Palestinians post-Hamas, where they're empowered, doesn't seem to be anywhere. There either seems to be plans for Israel to control the security situation after with troops on the ground, but nowhere that creates a state. And so with no plans for Ukrainian, Freudian slip, with Palestinian statehood, with the casualty rates for civilians so high, with the amount of care that's being put into trying to protect for civilian casualties, not being as high as it could be, to be frank, with the amount of starvation that's being caused, with them controlling the borders and not allowing a ton of aid, which is on the border, to go in, more experts are not being convinced by their argument that it is to just pressure Hamas. And in order to prove UN's definition of genocide, you need to say that there's no other option. There's other versions of definitions of genocide that if you wanted to go by, like, for example, during the same time this definition of genocide was created by the UN, there were Polish legal scholars that wanted it to be more expansive and have to deal more with groups and crimes against groups than necessarily the intent of the act. That the intent doesn't necessarily matter. But that's not what the UN decided. The UN decided that it was the intent that matters. And so the wiggle room has always been, well, the intent could be described as self-defense. Well, the intent could be described as the elimination of Hamas. Well, the intent could be described as a removal from Hamas from a position of power because Israel sees them as a threat to their security after the October 7th terrorist attacks. And so that deniability still exists for a lot of scholars. As we said, this is only 28% of the people who are part of this organization took a vote, and 86% of them. So not even everyone in this group agree with that. And there are other organizations that have yet to take up this. And the UN itself has not decided in favor yet. And they say that it has a stay until 2026 on that decision after South Africa filed the case back in, I believe it was 23, might have been early 24. But as Israel continues the war and it continues to grind on, as the humanitarian situation on the ground continues to worsen, the thing that's giving Israel less wiggle room is certain actions like starvation that seems to have less military advantage than the amount of harm that it is doing on the civilian population and is already illegal under international law. It's not a question of whether Israel's committing crimes. Israel is committing crimes. It's a question of whether Israel is committing the crime of genocide. And it has to be completely undeniable that their only plan is to either remove the Palestinians from Gaza completely or eliminate them entirely. And that can be their intent, not a side effect of their action. If all of this was a side effect of their actions, and it wasn't their intent, that still would not count because of the high standards the UN have set out in comparison to what other Polish legal scholars wanted back during the when this term was created and hoisted up after World War II. But that lack of deniability is being seen in the actions they take around starvation and in combination. So I think that's almost certainly why more and more experts are saying it. But as long as there's any wiggle room and the Israeli lawyers and their defense at the UN and the public officials will continue to assert there is, then there will be scholars who continue to ask questions. And that's because people also, even if there is a genocide taking place, if we were to say there is an assertive genocide taking place, and we know that for sure, any government committing a genocide is going to hide that information on the margins because they know that genocide is basically being made into kind of the, I don't want to say like the Super Bowl of crimes, but like the big crime. Everybody wants their crime to be called a genocide because it's going to get a bunch of attention attached to it. And I think that has negative side effects, obviously, but that's just how the cookie crumbles. And so they want their thing to be defined as a genocide. The Israelis are going to fight against it tooth and nail. I'm going to say their thing. They want what's happening to the Palestinians to be defined as a genocide. The Israelis are going to fight it tooth and nail. And as long as there's any deniability, I don't expect the UN to decide that it is a genocide. And we have another 5 or 6 or 7 months until we feel any actual movement from the United Nations. We got to wait until 2026. I'm sure the Israelis will put forward evidence, for example, like demographic data about I know there's been assertions that the population has increased amongst Palestinians, but I would also put forward that I don't believe that population increase has been in Gaza, has it? So as this continues, the war continues, there's still no end in sight, and the Israelis have called up thousands of reservists to report for duty as they are going to engage in another offensive into Gaza City to clear out more resistance in the enclave. As they're intensifying their attacks, the UN is warning of horrific consequences for the families who have continued to scuttle deeper and deeper into southern Gaza. And as hospitals have gotten bombed, as journalists have gotten bombed in areas that are supposed to be safe zones or reported to be safe zones, hospitals are reporting that women and children are amongst those getting killed in Israeli strikes this week. On Wednesday, most of them in the north and west, there were women and children amongst the 30 Palestinians killed. The Israeli military chief, though, vowed they're going to continue to strike these centers of Hamas activity until the organization is defeated. How we get to that point, though, from here is still a question. As Hamas, after taking out most of its military leadership and straining its allies, straining the pathway to get guns and support into the enclave, when is this ultimate victory against Hamas to be declared? Is it when Israel firmly controls all of the Gaza Strip? And if that is the case, then was their strategy of moving into one area, moving into another, Hamas then pops up behind them after they're not able to properly clear out the tunnels? Was this back and forth over all of Gaza the best way to go about it? Or was that the best way to go about a demolition job? Israel dismisses spin after Hamas says it is ready for comprehensive Gaza deal. Israel has rejected a statement from Hamas saying the armed group is ready for a comprehensive deal to end the Gaza war and free all of its hostages. This is more spin by Hamas that has nothing new, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said, and insisted the war would only end once the 48 hostages, 20 of whom are believed to be alive, were released, and Hamas was disarmed, Gaza demilitarized, and Israel had security control over the Strip, and an alternative civilian administration was established. Hamas reiterated its call for a deal that would see hostages exchanged for Palestinian prisoners, Israeli forces could withdraw, border crossings reopened, and the start of reconstruction. The group also said it agreed to the formation of an administration run by an independent technocrat to govern post-war Gaza. It issued statements on Tuesday evening, hours after U.S. President Donald Trump wrote on social media, tell Hamas to immediately give back all 20 hostages, not 2 or 5 or 7, and things will change rapidly. It will end. Last month, Hamas said it had accepted a plan from the regional mediators, Qatar and Egypt, that would see 10 living hostages and the bodies of 18 hostages released during a 60-day truce in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and detainees in Israeli jails. Israel has yet to formally respond to this proposal, a decision that Egypt said on Tuesday reflected a complete absence of Israeli will for de-escalation and achieving calm and peace. The proposal was said by Qatar to be almost identical to an earlier one from the U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, which Israel accepted, but Hamas had rejected, partially because it did not include a guarantee that the temporary ceasefire would lead to a permanent one. Netanyahu announced Israel's intention to conquer all of Gaza after indirect negotiations with Hamas on Witkoff's proposal broke down in July. So the goal is to conquer all of Gaza, destroy Hamas, and then create a civilian administration. Hamas has agreed to a civilian administration, though they've agreed to technocrats. Exactly how that would be managed, I'm sure there would be differences. And Hamas has agreed also to put down its arms after there was the creation of a Palestinian state. But Israel does not agree to a Palestinian state. And they also don't believe that these are the circumstances by which a Palestinian state could ever be created, because if they were to create a Palestinian state in these circumstances, would that not be rewarding the Palestinians for October 7th and the fallout from it? I would say that there's also a question not about rewarding, but about creating a foundation to stop another October 7th and having a body by which Palestinians can democratically voice their grievances and, have representation and have some sovereignty is a pressure valve that can push people to, instead of going to organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they could go to more moderate groups that are certainly not going to like Israel, but are not going to be actively lobbing rockets at them. And other than that, a continued occupation, I don't see that bringing down tensions. I only see that as a way to ratchet them up. So I understand not wanting to reward October 7th, but people also need to, there needs to also be an understanding that the foundation that led to October 7th was unstable, so we can't return to it. And what we can return to instead shouldn't be just the further disempowerment of the Palestinians, because if you just continue to disempower them and continue to crush them, even if people crushed eventually will lash out, even if it's irrational and self-destructive. My gosh, what a plan this was. The goal, a thriving Gaza at the crossroads of a new Abrahamic architecture. The risk, Gaza is an Iranian outpost in a moderate part of the region that will threaten IMEC Abrahamic architecture and undermine any future Palestinian self-governance. The opportunity, Gaza is a regional trade hub at the crossroads of an ancient sea route, Egypt, Gaza, Babylon, and the incense trade route, India, Yemen, Arabia, Europe. It can thrive once again at the center of a pro-American regional architecture.